So welcome back to another edition of the Heart to Heart podcast. And my guest today is Robb Wolf. Robb is a former research biochemist, and he's also the host of the Healthy Rebellion podcast. So Robb, welcome to the show.
Hey, huge honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on. And, just before we get started, is there anything else you wanted to tell the audience before? A little bit about your background or your book or anything like that?
I'm an Aquarius. I like long walks on the beach. I'm more of a cat guy than a dog guy, although I'm finding my life becoming more and more dog centric than cat centric. So yeah.
Well, thanks for letting us know that. But I'll also let everyone else know that Robb's a huge author as well. He's got a book, The Paleo Solution, which is, I guess, one of his older books now. It must be close to 10 years old.
Yep.
Wired to Eat is another one. I purchased both those books. I probably read Paleo Solution in particular, a couple times, read back, went through a few chapters. And now he's got another one, The Sacred Cow, which is one of your more recent ones. So
yep.
Awesome. So, again, thanks so much for coming on. So, I guess we should get started in the nutrition field, since that's, definitely your field of expertise. And, like we were just chatting before the show, we were talking just a little bit about electrolytes and how they're so important for us. And, you got this new product that you developed. So you just tell us a little bit about that, and just, why did you develop that product, and what do you expect people, what should people expect when they use it in terms of results?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep that brief. Like, the genesis story of Element is actually kind of lengthy at this point, but so I'm a research biochemist by training. I was 23 years ago looking at either going a medical school route, a PhD route, or possibly an MD PhD combo. And around that time, I developed ulcerative colitis, and it was so severe that surgery looked like it was kind of my best option. I'm about 165 pounds right now. I'm 5'9". At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was 125, 130 pounds. So my malabsorption was so terrible. Like, I was eating food, but it was coming out basically the way it went in. And there were a host of factors at play here. Like, I was eating a high carb, low fat vegan diet, which for my physiology does not work, but the additional compounders, I was living in Seattle. I had not seen the sun in years. Like, I lived in a basement apartment with a tiny window that faced north. I was out of the house before the sun came up. I was back home when the sun went down. When I did finally get my vitamin D levels checked around that time, they were like 11 or 12. And you would like to see them in like the 60s or above, for Caucasian male. And so I had that stuff going on. I was living like a complete asshole. Like, I was trying to sleep 3, maybe 4 hours a night. I was in that whole camp of like, sleep is for the weak. You sleep when you're dead. And so even though my health is much better today, I've got a bunch of these other lifestyle factors buttoned up. I don't want to overly throw that vegan diet under the bus, but it definitely was not supporting what I had going on. But nothing I was doing was supporting what I had going on. But it was around this time that, out of desperation, I started looking around for some way to deal with this ulcerative colitis. And this idea of a low carb paleo type diet got on my radar. And mind you, this was 1998. And so this idea of a paleo diet got on my radar through kind of an interesting set of circumstances. I went into this fancy new search engine called Google and put in Paleolithic diet, and I found some work by two main people, Lauren Cordain and Arthur Devaney. And what was interesting to me is that they talked a lot about the gut and autoimmune issues that have arisen with the development of kind of modern agriculture and whatnot. And I was like, man, this sounds like me. Like, I don't know if you can really see, but I had like some beginnings of rheumatoid arthritis popping up in my knuckles and stuff like that. I had all the gut issues. And so I just thought, well, I don't know, maybe this high protein, high fat diet is going to give me heart disease, but at least that's 20 or 30 years down the road versus dying right now from ulcerative colitis. And so I gave this thing a shot. And it was life-changing for me. Like, it literally saved my life. And then I also started thinking about things in this kind of evolutionary biology way. and thought about sleep and circadian biology and sunlight and vitamin D and gut microbiome and like all this other stuff kind of came into play there. So for the better part of 23 years, I've mainly eaten a low carb diet, and I've generally motored along great with that. But I also co-founded the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms. So I was very, very early in the CrossFit scene. I do some Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. And so the type of activities I've historically participated in are very glycolytic and high intensity in nature. And a low carb diet is tough to fuel that activity. Like I always felt like I was lacking this lower gear. And I spent all of this time trying to figure out, like, do I do some carbs before a workout? Do I do some carbs after a workout? Do I do some during the workout? You know, and I just never really got things quite dialed in and quite right. And again, I motored forward for a number of years, but just kept tinkering, kept fiddling, because I had really good cognitive function on low carb. My GI problems were largely resolved, but I just didn't have that like athletic chutzpah that I really wanted, you know, for the activities that I was doing. And I guess it was about 5 years ago now, I met these two guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villaseñor. They're the founders of Keto Gains. And I started kind of stalking their community, and they've got this online Facebook community that's got a couple of 100,000 people, and they just get these amazing results with these with a appropriate protein, not a low protein keto approach, but an appropriate protein, you know, smartly formulated ketogenic diet. And I saw some people in there doing Brazilian Jiu-jitsu and CrossFit, and they were really successful. So I basically like wore these guys down. I'm like, hey, will you look at what I'm doing? And they looked at it. What they wanted me to do was basically put everything that I was consuming into a dietary, you know, a recorder, kind of like chronometer. And you could see the protein, carbs, fat, but you would also see the minerals like the sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And when they did an initial survey of what I was up to, they were just like, I think your macros are fine. Your protein, carbs, fat are fine. The problem here is that you're probably not getting enough sodium. And I just dismissed it out of hand. You know, I'm looking at people who are doing something much better than what I'm doing, and then they give me advice, and of course I ignore it. You know, you never accept free great advice from world experts, you know, the first go around.
And so you're probably not likely to think that, oh, salt, this is just going to fix everything, right?
Yeah, well, and I didn't have an aversion to salt. Like long ago, I looked at the research on salt, and I'm like, oh, the problems with sodium and hypertension, that's all like insulin resistance driven. And so that's not my problem. And so I definitely salted my food. I didn't avoid salty foods, but it was about another year of fiddling and still struggling. And these guys basically said, okay, weigh and measure everything you consume, including your outside salt sources and everything, and get back to us. And they wanted me to be at least 5 grams of sodium per day, 5,000 milligrams of sodium per day.
Shit.
I was getting less than 2. And so they're like, just up your sodium, drink some pickle juice, do this, do that. And I did it. And no joke. I mean, of course, this, the guy who is now selling salt, like I'm going to say, oh, it was a miracle, but it was in fact a miracle. Like it was literally like a light switch was flipped. And when you think about the fact that every process in our body that involves energy production, thinking, moving, digestion, like everything, it's driven by sodium potassium pumps. Like these sodium potassium pumps are basically the engines of life, you know? And if those things are off, then you are off just catastrophically. And one of the things that it's really powerful for me, but I'm a nerd and I don't get out a lot and I don't have much of a social life. But when I started thinking about emergency medicine, like if one ends up in an emergency room, say unconscious, what are the first things that a doctor is going to look at? And they're going to look at your pH and they're going to look at your electrolytes. Because if your pH goes up or down a little bit, you could get very sick or you could die. And if your electrolytes are off by very much, you could get very sick and you could die. They are arguably the most tightly regulated physiological processes in the body. So when, it was just like when I figured out, oh my God, like salt and sodium in particular, but electrolytes in general was just this massive missing link. I went on this kind of crazy bender of looking into, well, what do they recommend in a medically supervised ketogenic diet? Like if you have epilepsy and you're put on a medically supervised ketogenic diet, your dietitian will make certain that you get at least 5 grams of sodium per day. Like you will end up eating olives, you will have chicken bouillon cubes, but whatever. It's understood within these circles that this process called the natriuresis of fasting is a real thing, and it's crippling if you don't address it. And when people go on a low carb diet, when they are fasting, their insulin levels drop, which causes a reduction in a hormone called aldosterone, and aldosterone causes us to retain sodium. And that is a great scenario to fix if you're an overweight, peri-diabetic, hypertensive person who modifies your diet and exercise and you lose a bunch of water. That's a good thing. But if you're already lean and athletic and you are in this situation where your body is wanting to shed sodium, you can have a lot of problems. You have lethargy, fatigue, brain fog. You have your athletic capacity is just dramatically, curtailed and impacted. So this thing just kind of blew me away. And Tyler and Luis had known about this for ages. They're like, yeah, man, we totally get this. But for me, it was super new and interesting. And so we recognized that the main struggle that we were seeing within our various communities, this kind of paleo, low carb, keto, even carnivore camp, so many of the challenges that people faced were from likely low sodium. And so we put together this thing that was a homebrew guide. It was like, take this much table salt, this much potassium chloride, which is a product, no salt, get some magnesium citrate or some magnesium malate, lemon juice, stevia, shake it up, and there you go. And we just offered this free downloadable guide. And within 6 months, we had 500,000 downloads of this thing.
Holy
like it
shit.
was crazy. Like it was so popular. And
you don't get that many downloads unless people are, responding to it. I mean,
yeah,
so, right?
It
so
was
500,000 in 6 months. That's insane, right?
It was, yeah. And we have decent sized platforms, but I'm not like a huge platform, like we were punching way above our weight class with regards to the reach that we had on this. And it was clearly addressing a bunch of needs that people had. Their performance was better, their sleep was better. A common side effect of low carb with inadequate sodium is that people have disturbed sleep, they have elevated heart rate, like on and on and on, all these problems. But then folks started saying, hey, I really dig this keto aid stuff, but when I travel, the 3 bags of white powder are a problem for TSA. Like I have problems with this all the time. And so people started asking us for some sort of a convenience play. And so we started kind of looking into what would be involved with spinning up a product that addressed these electrolyte needs. And the way that we arrived at the formula is we looked at the diets of about 200 people that were eating a lower carb, adequate protein, but whole food based diet. Very, very little junk. So they're getting lots of vegetables, lots of meat and seafood, nuts and seeds. And we looked at where they were deficient, and they were good on calcium, a little shy on magnesium, skinnier still on potassium, but they were like woefully inadequate in sodium. And so we formulated element with that gram of sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, 60 milligrams of magnesium to address these gaps. And I think that was reasonably concise, but I mean, that is the genesis story of this whole thing. Like we did not set out intending to be like salt moguls or anything. Like we just really, again, Tyler and Luis were fully aware that the sodium issue was a major, major thing. But when I found out that this was probably the major impediment to my performance and some additional health issues, I just kind of went crazy with it and kind of lit a fire under those guys to generate some content so that we could help people understand, hey, if you are struggling on any type of dietary change, you are likely dealing with the effects of your body getting more insulin sensitive. So you're not holding on to sodium, and you probably need to supplement that. And that was kind of our center of the bullseye, was kind of people changing dietary practices for kind of body composition reasons. And then over time, we've expanded out, recognizing that there are all these athletic needs for increased sodium intake. different health situations like postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, breastfeeding. Like we just started finding all these different, I guess, verticals, you would say, where people really benefited from increasing their sodium and electrolyte intake.
That's yeah, that's quite a lot of information. So I have a lot of questions for you about that. In particular, so when you are on a low carb diet, like you said, that like it is pretty common then to have low sodium, and then that's going to affect, you said, like mental function, cognitive function, physical performance, exercise performance, basically everything. And
Yeah.
so, I'm just kind of thinking out loud now, but I mean, that's probably a reason maybe why some people, ditch the low carb diets at times, is because, they're feeling unwell, not necessarily directly because of they're eating low carbs. It's that they're low in sodium. And I imagine
Yep.
that some people who have ditched low carb or Paleolithic diets, they did it thinking that, if I just add the carbs back in, I'll feel better. When in reality, what they needed was a little bit more sodium. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you on that as well is, so how is 5 grams a day determined? And like, do some people need more and some people need less? Like, how do you guys kind of figure that out? Just because for myself, like I'm about 200 pounds, so I assume then I would need maybe a little bit more than you if we're following similar diets and have similar activity levels. Because like yourself, I'm very active as well. Like basically exercise every single day.
Right.
And like I was saying before the show, like yesterday, I lifted weights, I ran on the treadmill, and I went in my sauna. So I mean, I was just sweating like crazy, right? So and you use more on certain days than other days, like depending upon your activity level?
Yeah, yeah. So the where we arrive at kind of our the most difficult thing for us to pin down is exactly how much electrolytes an individual needs, and
Okay.
it's based off of size, some individual genetics. Like some people are what we call super sweaters, like they just
That's
sweat
me.
more and their sweat
That's me.
beads are huge and everything. Ironically, it's actually a very inefficient way to sweat. You would rather it be like, women tend to be more efficient sweaters. They have smaller sweat glands and they get the better evaporative cooling. Usually super sweaters also excrete more sodium, like per volume of sweat that they produce. Heat, humidity, altitude, all are factors in that. And they can change things by multiples. So what we started with was kind of digging in and like, okay, what are at least some lower and upper bounds that are fairly evidence-based? And we had kind of two pieces on that 5 grams is kind of the bottom level, and the first part of that I alluded to, which is within most medical circles, it's kind of recognized that somebody on a lower carb diet, they seem to benefit from being at least 5 grams of sodium per day. Oftentimes it can be double or triple of that, depending
Holy
again on
shit.
size and activity level and all that stuff. But we looked at another piece to get outside of just kind of like a low carb population, which was at a population level, at a more macro level. What do we see with regards to, say, morbidity and mortality related to sodium intake? And there was a really interesting paper that looked at sodium intake in type 2 diabetic heart patients. So these are folks that are already pretty sick. They're already suffering some heart issues. And usually they are like center of the bullseye for what the mainstream medical circles would say is the person that should reduce sodium intake. But what was interesting is what emerged was a U curve. There was a curve that showed that at 2 grams or less of intake, morbidity and mortality, sickness and death was quite high. When you got down to about 5 grams of sodium intake per day was the lowest point. And we see U curves like this in biology all the time. Like too little vitamin D is a problem, too much vitamin D is a problem. We want to be within some sort of, Goldilocks kind of optimized zone. But
I
what
think
was
alcohol
really
falls in that zone too
alcohol
as well.
probably, yeah, almost everything has kind of a dose response curve like that. But what was interesting is folks had to get up to 8 grams of sodium to have the same morbidity and mortality as the 2 grams of sodium. So it was clearly far more, 2 takeaways from that. 5 grams seemed to be kind of the low point for morbidity and mortality within this group. And it was far more dangerous to have too little sodium versus too much sodium. And you know, by like nearly a factor of 2. Like one of the things that they use to assess drugs and their utility and efficacy is how much do you need to take for an effective dose to get the job done versus how much becomes toxic. And we would like drugs to have a really massive difference between efficacy and toxicity. If the efficacy and toxicity are like virtually the same, then we've got a really big problem there. With sodium, there's actually seems to be a pretty good spread on that. And so that kind of bracketed the low end for us. We're like 5 grams a day seems reasonable for most people. There are some people who are sodium sensitive hyper responders. If they consume a little bit of sodium, they see a really significant increase in their blood pressure. But it's worth mentioning, most of those folks are insulin resistant. So if they modify their diet, such diet and lifestyle, so that they return to a more insulin sensitive state, they tend to not respond to sodium in such a negative fashion. And ironically, then they usually need some sodium. But bracketing the upper end, we looked at what the ACSM, the American Council of Sports Medicine guidelines suggested. And it was recommended that for hard training athletes, hot, humid, altitude environments, you know, these different things that increase the need for hydration. And hydration in a textbook of medical physiology is not water. It is water and electrolytes. And this is something that's been missed like again and again and again. Just giving people water without adequate electrolytes. And the electrolytes could come from diet. Like you could eat some salty nuts or like, you know, some pickles or olives or something. You get a good amount of sodium, potassium from that. Then you just need to sip plain water. If you're not getting salty foods in your diet, then you probably need to add electrolytes to your water. So, but the ACSM guidelines recommend between 7 and 10 grams of sodium per day for hard training athletes. And I would say that even that is still kind of a starting place. We've done some work with some professional sports teams, NHL being one of the groups that really quantifies electrolyte and water loss better than most of the other outfits that I've seen. And some of these larger male athletes.
As a hockey player, I mean, you know, recreational hockey player when I was younger, like the sweat that comes off you in hockey, you know, it's, you know, it's almost incomparable to some other sports sometimes.
Yeah.
Like it's crazy how much you sweat when you're playing hockey. It's probably just because of it's really the sport that has all the gear on it, you know? So I can imagine that, you know, they would benefit, you know, tremendously from you know, measuring their physiology and making the appropriate adjustments, you know?
Yeah. So they do these things, sweat patches, which they calculate how much surface area the person has, and then they cover some percentage of that area with a sweat patch, which absorbs water, and it quantifies the amount of sodium excreted, because we really don't excrete much potassium or magnesium in the sweat. It's almost purely sodium. And the really conservative estimates are that these larger male athletes in the course of a hard game or hard practice, about an hour and a half, 2 hours, they're losing 10 pounds of water and upwards of 10 grams of sodium. And if they don't replenish that, you will feel terrible. You have poor performance. Your cortisol levels will be higher. You do have a reserve of sodium in your bones, but when you go to pull sodium out of the bones, you also pull calcium out. So this is also a potential driver of osteoporosis and osteopenia.
And Rob, sorry, just to interrupt you for a sec there. You know, just really interesting about the cortisol, because, you know, a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people do work out after work, right? So they're working out in the evening time. And you mentioned cortisol. So, I mean, if you're, you know, losing all your salt, which drives up your cortisol, I mean, that's going to be horrible for your sleep pattern at night. And, you know, Rob, I remember in your very first book, I'm not sure if it was your first book, in Paleo Solution anyway, you had, I remember, you know, a really nice graph, I remember, you know, indicating what your cortisol levels should be like. And basically they should be, you know, highest in the morning and, you know, slowly decline throughout the day. So at night you can sleep. And that's a common problem for a lot of athletes is they have insomnia at night.
Yep.
And I think that maybe some of it could be related to this salt issue, because particularly if you're, I mean, 10 grams, I had no idea. So you're providing me with a ton of education today, so I really appreciate this discussion. But I mean, that's a lot of salt to lose. And then
It
again, like,
is.
if you're not replacing that, when cortisol goes up, I mean, of course you're not going to be able to sleep at night.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
so anyways, just wanted to make that point there. So go ahead.
No, it's a great point, but it's a real eye opener, for what the sodium demands are for folks. And within the keto gains community, we even see some small females that are kind of CrossFit Games athletes that are maybe doing multiple sessions a day. They're outside in the sun. We see some women that are on the smaller side that are up to 14, 15 grams of sodium per day consistently. And they also eat a little bit on the lower carb side of things. I think if they ate a little bit more carbs, their body would hold on to a little bit more sodium. And so they may not need quite as much, but for a variety of reasons, they end up finding that they do pretty well at that like 120 grams of carbs per day level. But that provides this kind of spectrum of where folks ideally should end up, somewhere between 5 and maybe as high as 12, 15 grams of sodium for really hard charging athletes. And again, we're not suggesting that folks get that 100% from Element or some other electrolyte, replacement. Ideally, you have a well-composed whole food diet. You salt your food pretty vigorously, and you make good use of salty foods. Pickles, olives, like 10 olives provides a gram of sodium. Some pickle juice, just a little bit of it, provides a gram of sodium. Usually one of my favorite lunches, particularly after doing jiu-jitsu, is salami and cheese, because it's easy for me to get like 2 grams of sodium out of that meal, and it tastes really good. And it's not that much bulk. I do jiu-jitsu. It starts at noon. It finishes at 2. I like to get a decent lunch in, but I don't want a massive amount of bulk there, because we're going to sit down and have dinner as a family with my kids in like 2 or 3 hours. And so I want to get some calories in post-workout. I want to get some sodium in because it definitely helps with my recovery. But so instead of just like swigging a bunch of different drinks, I have a lunch that is like an antipasto plate with salami, cheese, olives, pepperoncinis, and all that stuff. It's a bunch of really tasty, salty foods. And so that is kind of the ideal way that we recommend, is try to get the bulk of your electrolyte needs and your sodium needs from whole foods, and then use some sort of a smartly formulated electrolyte beverage, whether somebody does our home brew or they do Element or whatever, to kind of round out the additional needs.
Okay, and because I was actually just gonna ask you about that. So, first of all, as a base, make sure that you're salting all your foods and eating foods that have salt in them as your
Yep.
base. But when you work out as hard as someone like you do, and you follow say like a low carb diet, and you're at risk of being low in sodium, sometimes foods just aren't going to cut it. So how would someone use these products? Like, would they be best using them, say, like first thing in the morning? Like, I'm not sure if you follow that theory, but a lot of people do suggest drinking some salt in the morning. Yep. Because it can really help. I think the mechanism of action there, and you can correct me on this, is it just helps you wake up a little bit more naturally, so you're not like pumping out all your catecholamines right off the bat of the day. Right. And then, or would you use it to, say, in addition to like maybe something before this, like you have a podcast and you want to be, cognitively or mentally sharp. And then the same thing too with like exercise performance. Like, would you do it before, during, after? Like what do you think is the best way to kind of get the best results?
Yeah, I mean, best is going to be a little subjective to the person, but I'll share what I end up doing.
Okay, sure.
And it's funny. During the summer, I kind of lose my taste for coffee. Like, I don't know what it is, but like I just don't like coffee that much during the summer. And so I tend to switch to a black tea. And it was a couple of weeks ago. So normally I would do a black coffee, and then, it's like a 20-ounce mug. You don't want this stuff too concentrated because it is a gram of sodium. And then I would do like one of the chocolate salts in the coffee, a little splash of whole cream, and it's amazing. It's like a mocha or something, you know, but I don't really like coffee right now. So I was messing around with the black tea, and I tried watermelon, a raspberry, and an orange so far in that black tea, and it's amazing. So I'll start the day with that, and then usually we're loading up to go to jiu-jitsu by about 11:30. It's about a half-hour drive to the gym, and I mix up two 32-ounce containers with one stick pack in each one, and I'll sip on one of them driving to the gym, just a little sip here and there. And I will sip on that during our drilling and kind of technique part of the class, which is 1 hour. And then usually I'm just about done with that by the time that we get to open mat and live rolling. And then before open mat, I will go over and do a pretty good chug. Like I might do like a third of the 32-ounce container. I'll do my rolling. Sometimes I'll go over and grab another sip. Usually I don't get a chance to until we're done. And then I drink the rest of that as I go home. And then I might have another one somewhere in the afternoon. If I'm feeling kind of lethargic and sluggish, it's interesting. There were just some great studies that were released looking at improvements in heart rate variability score and overall recovery with sodium loading post-workout. So like if I'm feeling kind of knackered,
Very interesting.
is buy a bunch of salt, but I literally kind of drink myself out of that overtrained feeling by just consuming sodium. And again, this is mixed into the context of eating a whole food diet that I focus on kind of sodium rich foods. But the improvements in my recovery have just been shocking. So I'll have one straight out of the gate in the morning, usually in like a coffee or a tea. I have two others, peri-workout. So I'm kind of doing some before, I'm doing a little bit during, and then I definitely do some afterwards. And then in the afternoon, I may or may not have more depending on what's going on. And like I did a jiu-jitsu camp pre-COVID down in Costa Rica, and it was 95 degrees, 94% humidity. And we were in like a metal building in Costa Rica, and it was fucking hot. It was hot and humid, and you're wearing pajamas and you've got people laying on you. And I would say through the 3-hour session, I probably did two 64-ounce containers, each of those having 2 stick packs, so 2 grams of element. I like mine a little more on the dilute side. Like my wife would do more like 20 ounces of fluid and be good with that. So I ended up doing basically a gallon of water plus 4 grams of sodium over that 3-hour period. And that was just while I was training. And if I didn't do that, I would start getting like the toe cramps and the brain fade and all that type of stuff. And it's worth mentioning. Usually people notice decreased coordination, mental fatigue, brain fade, decreased cardiorespiratory endurance well in advance of cramping. When you get to the point where you're getting like cramps in your toes, cramps in your calf, you are really, really electrolyte deficient at that point. Like you've gone really far down the road. Like we should effectively never experience cramping if we're staying on the electrolytes properly.
So Rob, will kind of affect you more cognitively initially than it will physically, you would say?
Yeah.
Okay. And that kind of makes sense too. Like, I'm not sure if, I'm sure this happens to you maybe in jiu-jitsu, like later on in the practice, someone like teaches you something, and for whatever reason, like you're just not getting it for whatever reason, like, I don't know why, it just kind of happens, and you kind of feel stupid, but it's probably, has to do something with, a loss of, electrolytes, because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, this happens to lots of people, lots of fighters I talk to, like, later on in the session when someone's calling out combos, they just start screwing them up just because, they're just not as sharp mentally, so that's kind of interesting that, and probably surprising to a lot of people, including myself, that, first you're going to be affected cognitively before physically. So very interesting. So sorry, you can go ahead.
No, that was really it. And I mean, no matter how much electrolytes you have on board, at some point you will get fatigued. You will have some degree of mental fade, but my my sense around that is if we have adequate hydration, which means water and electrolytes, you can push that out a lot. Like I think you can remain much more focused and on point. And again, if we're enhancing that recovery side of it, like not only were we able to train with more focus and potentially more intensity on the front end, but we are better able to recover on the back end. So I feel like it's just this kind of ergogenic win coming and going.
Okay. And then also too, just to kind of recap what you said. So basically, again, you want to have your base as of whole foods that have lots of salt on them, and make sure that you're using, your salt shaker, liberally. And then if you're going to use products, first thing in the morning is a real good time to use it. And then around your workouts, and probably, slightly more loaded, say, before and in the first half of your workout, as opposed to the second half. That would kind of be the best.
Beautiful summary. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the only thing I'd add to that is if you're feeling kind of knackered after the training,
yeah,
maybe add some more later in the day. Like it may be that you just went too hard that day, but it may be that you're also still a little bit electrolyte deficient. And for sure, if you're experiencing any type of cramping, like people will stretch out in bed when they're sleeping and they get a calf cramp or a toe cramp or something, that means that you were really wantonly electrolyte deficient, and you really need to get in and address that.
Okay. And then one last question on that too. So if you, like you said, I'm not sure, but it kind of sounds like some of your workout days are fairly similar. But, like you said, you had that time in Costa Rica where, the weather was hotter and it seemed like you were working out for longer. So you would then have like an extra pack sometimes if you were going to have an unusually long workout.
Yep, for sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, interesting. And then still on that note, but just slightly different topic. With regards to exogenous ketones, like first of all, I just would like to know your opinion on them in general, but also too, I noticed that a lot of those products do have some other electrolytes or something else in them to try to like balance them out. So I'm just wondering what your comments are on that.
Yeah, I mean, as with virtually any supplement, like even protein powder or what have you, the use it, don't use it thing is really dependent on the person's goals. Like, why are you using it? Like, what is the goal for using it? I think that these ketone salts are interesting for some medical applications, like on the performance side. And the ketone salt folks are going to get really cranky at me for saying this, but my sense, so they provide an enormous amount of electrolytes. Like they usually have a lot of sodium, potassium, magnesium in them because the ketone body is attached to some salts.
Well,
and when Tyler and Luis and I really scrutinized the literature on that stuff, we were kind of like, I think all that they're doing is supplementing electrolytes in these people, but it's with ketone salts. So I personally, like, if somebody is really looking to get kind of a ketone bump, I kind of lean more towards like a tablespoon of MCT oil, like a good C8 MCT oil. Too much MCT can cause GI upset, but I've seen a lot of people, for whatever reason, like I'm one of these people, like I do not tolerate ketone salts at all. Like I get really profound nausea. I get the disaster pants effect and whatnot. And so I have kind of a personal aversion to them, just on my level, and just working with people. I've noticed like, somebody adds a little bit of MCT oil to their coffee and then they eat that with a meal. And there's a tendency for folks, and Chris Masterjohn talked about this probably 2-3 years ago, but MCT added to a regular meal that also even contains carbs, people will tend to then subsequently consume fewer calories spontaneously later in the day. So if we're approaching this from like a fat loss or a body recomposition perspective, the data seems to lean a little bit more towards the MCT added to the mix. And I don't entirely know what's going on there, but the MCT will transiently elevate ketone levels. And it may be that some ketones plus some carbs sends a signal to the brain that's like, hey, we are good on calories. Like, you don't need to worry. You can dial down appetite a little bit, and then people may spontaneously consume fewer calories later. But again, it's going to be super context driven, based off of what the goal is for a ketone salt versus a ketone ester versus something like MCT oil.
Okay, interesting. And my experience with the ketones is I have found them to be effective at times, but like I haven't taken them, say, in like over a year or so now, just because I have sometimes gotten a headache with it.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody gets that side effect. I might just be a little bit unlucky in that regard. And then coming back to the MCT oil, so for people who do get disaster pains, and I'm one of those people who, when they use a lot of MCT oil for whatever reason, and I'm not saying this is definitely gonna work out for you, but I have used MCT oil powder, and
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, I just don't like get disaster pants as much. I don't know like what it is, but when I use the powder versus the oil, and that's what I put in my coffee every morning, I find that I just don't get that side effect. One other thing that I wanted to mention too. So, earlier in the conversation, we were talking a little bit about carbs, and I think you sort of brought up the number 100 to 125 grams of carbs a day. And, that's basically bang on like what I'm eating right now, around 100 to 125 grams of carbs a day. So my question is sort of like the electrolytes, like how would you eat if you were going to, only to consume about, 100 to 150 grams of carbs a day or less? When would you consume those carbohydrates, in particular in relation to performance? And it could be mental performance, or it could be physical performance.
Oh man, that's a good question. And that's a tough one because some folks, they noticed that they're a little bit more on point. Like Charles Poliquin was kind of famous for recommending this meat and nuts breakfast. So it
I
literally
remember
like
that.
hunk of protein and big handful of nuts. And so you mainly get protein and fat, just a real low titration of carbs. And I gotta say, like starting the day like that, like you're just kind of firing on all cylinders. You feel really good. Other people just feel good with like some fruit with breakfast and whatnot, or whatever the carb source it is. I guess you could make the case that really taking advantage of that peri-workout period is valuable. So like the carbs, more post-workout than or a little bit before, maybe a little bit more afterwards, like that pre-workout nutrition. Luis has really educated me a lot on that, like even the pre-workout protein potentially being more important than the post-workout protein. So there's,
Wow.
there's
Okay.
kind of pluses and minuses there. And then that depends on what you're up to. Like you're not doing a shake right before a CrossFit workout seems like a great way to vomit. So, that seems like a tough deal. There is literature that suggests that consuming carbs earlier in the day, we're naturally more insulin sensitive. So you will tend to have a more favorable blood glucose response. But then for some people, carbs later in the day, it really facilitates good sleep.
Yeah.
Some like Dr. Huberman, the Huberman Lab podcast, he talks about sticking the bulk of his carbs later in the day because it really enhances for him kind of that tryptophan converted into serotonin melatonin process, and like it just kind of knocks him out and he has great sleep. So there's kind of three, four options lurking in there, trying to take advantage of some physiological insulin sensitivity and put more of the carbs earlier in the day. There's all the stuff around, peri-workout nutrition, pre and post. And then there's some ideas around, potentially enhancing sleep quality by having more or the bulk of your carbs later in the day. And I think all of those have laudable characteristics to it. I tend to, if I have more carbs, I will tend to have some at breakfast, and then my lunch, depending on how hard my training was, I will have more or less at lunch. And then dinner, I might have a little bit, but that'll be more of kind of like a keto ratioed dinner for the most part, depending on what I have going on. And I seem to do really well with that. Like the carbs later in the evening actually leave me kind of lethargic. Like it definitely I guess kind of calms me down, but it's almost too much. Like I can overdo it in the evening, I feel like.
Okay. Yeah, I'm probably a little bit more similar to Andrew Hoover, man. I tend to kind of load them a little bit more later in the
Evening.
evening.
Yeah.
And then but also too, I mean, it's because of the time that I train. So it seems like you train a lot in the middle of the day, whereas I tend to train most, not all the time, but I tend to train most of the time, after I come home from work. So,
Hmm.
somewhere after 5 p.m. So for me, if I'm going to, consume carbs, it does tend to be after my workout. And then like,
Yeah.
Andrew Hubman, I do find that, because of the tryptophan, conversion that, I will sleep a little bit better at night. So that's when I tend to do it. I haven't recently like eaten any carbs before and tried that out. So that's something that I may in fact, play around with a little bit. And then it also too seems to be, based upon what you just said, that if you're gonna have a day where, say, you're not exercising, and those days are very rare for me. It may be one day a week, but it's usually probably less, maybe 2 or 3 days a month. But if you do have a day like that, it seems that maybe you can eat carbs earlier in the day because and take advantage of that insulin sensitivity that's higher in the day as opposed to later in the day. So
Yeah.
it's interesting how you can play it in so many ways. Like you said, like there's no real right or wrong answer, and it's really just about listening to your own physiology, being aware, and then also to making sure that you're eating them in the situation that's best for you. And
Yeah.
if if you're having a hard workout at lunch, as opposed to supper, then it's probably better to eat them more around your workout at lunch. If you're doing it at lunch, and then obviously if you're working out in the evening time, to eat them more then. So I think it does depend upon several different factors. So Rob, I know we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, but can you tell us a little bit about the Sacred Cow and that project that you recently completed?
Oh yeah. So man,
In 2 or 3
pretty,
minutes, it's pretty
yeah,
hard to
yeah.
do, but
I'll try to be concise on this. So I started getting into this ancestral eating around 1998, and it was around 2001, 2002 that I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was kind of an ethical vegan, and he was talking about like greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants, and it got me thinking about like, well, what is energetically or thermodynamically efficient with food production? I just couldn't wrap my head around this idea that um, animals on grass was like a net loss for the planet. Like when you look at the land masses of the earth, nearly two-thirds of the land is grassland. And historically, like pre-human habitation, even where humans expanded, this grassland it had lots and lots of grazing animals on it, and so it stuck in my head that there was definitely a question there that needed answering, but we needed a lot more information. And so I've been thinking about this stuff for a long, long time. And it was around 2010 that Diana Rogers and I started really talking about this stuff, because this narrative around, there's always been this kind of vegan centric narrative around animal husbandry and meat consumption and dairy and all that stuff, that there are ethical considerations. And I think that there are some valid points there. Like the mistreatment of animals is something that's horrible and should not happen, and we should always work to improve that stuff. But there were a lot of other things that just didn't square, like the claims around deleterious health effects and whatnot. Because when you look closely at the nutrient deficiency issues that are endemic within vegan and vegetarian groups, they're identical to what we see in developing countries where people have limited or no access to animal products. Like they look virtually identical. So we started thinking about doing a book initially, and then it turned into a book and film, because what we needed to address was the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of a meat inclusive food system, and put it in the context of a global networked food system, the claims around climate change, impacts of animal husbandry. And we needed to do this in a really both concise but accurate fashion. Like if we were sloppy with our science, we were going to get nailed to the wall. And so it was maybe 2017 that, I mean, we had been compiling information, compiling data for a long time, but we really started working on this project in earnest. And it took us the better part of 4 years to write the book, and released it, unfortunately, like right in June last year, COVID high point, like there were no bookstores open and all that type of stuff, but it's been pretty well received. The book is cool in that if somebody really wants to see this case laid out, it allows us to go point by point by point and offer the references and for the claims that we're making. And then the film does largely the same thing, but it's much more in a story format, and so it's a little more emotive. And so if somebody is interested in this topic, but doesn't necessarily want to do the deep dive on the science, then the film is really valuable. And then anybody that's interested in really digging into science, and I super encourage people to look at all the references we cite and read those papers. And did we actually make claims based off of that research that is supported by that research? Oftentimes people will, throw a paper up in some sort of inline citation. You read the paper and like, that has nothing to do with what is being claimed here. And
happens too often, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, the main point that I would say that I think we did a really, really good job on this is there has not been one kind of vegan hit piece on the book, and the book's been out over a year and a half now. And the reason why I think we really nailed it is I think the book and film are so good and so on point that these folks actually had the good sense that, like, we don't want anybody looking at this, because if somebody really got in and started trying to scrutinize this for like logical flaws and inconsistencies, they're not there. It's not a perfect work. Like, we've already updated the book twice with some new information that has come to light. But even in that case, it was drawing a distinction. We made kind of like a lump sum statement, and then as some additional information came to light, we parsed that out and made well, this is accurate in this situation, and that's accurate in that situation. But we did a pretty goddamn good job on that book and the film, and it lays out a very compelling case. And I don't know that it's the final authority on any of this stuff, but it begins a really complex conversation that, the more vegan centric model is, if you don't eat animals, you will be skinny, you'll live forever, you'll never suffer chronic degenerative disease, you're saving all the animals, and you're going to save the planet. And it's a beautiful elevator pitch. And the unfortunate story in all that is that I think it's wrong at literally every turn. But then the counterpoint of that, it requires a mini PhD dissertation on every single one of those points if you're really going to do diligence in addressing the topics.
Well, I'm so glad that you did address those topics, because it's definitely something that should be addressed. And I encourage everyone that's listening to this to definitely check out Robb's book or Robb's film, Sacred Cow. And that's just a perfect note to leave on, Robb, because unfortunately we are out of time. So if you could just tell everybody where they can find you on Twitter, Instagram, a little bit about your podcast and whatever else you have going on.
Yeah, I mean, folks can find everything at robbwolf.com. That's ROBBWOLF.com.
Okay, awesome. Well, Robb, thanks so much for coming on. I learned so much today. I didn't know, there was that I could be so deficient in salt. So that's, something I'm going to start, implementing right away. So, thanks so much.
I didn't either. So that's what embarked me on this thing. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think a lot of people are probably going to be drinking a lot more salt now and getting some good results. So thanks so much for that. And thanks again for coming on.
Take care.